Just looking at the schedule, looking at the pieces that they've added, and knowing how close they were last year to breaking down that door, this feels like a year they need to get over the hump, and they can't lose games they have no business losing like they did last year. Hello and welcome in. It is always college football. It is February 10th, and I am your host, Greg McElroy, and we appreciate you being here today. It is right after the Super Bowl, so if you enjoyed the Super Bowl last night, if you were excited about the Super Bowl last night, we have officially watched our last football game for the next 8 months. I know those of you that indulge in UFL, by all means, great, go for it. I, however, don't watch as much UFL as I once did, but I will be watching some spring games coming up, and I will be excited about the season that is upon us here in 2025. I do think that this year, and I'm trying hard not to go down the rabbit hole of like fixing college football because I don't feel like it's broken. I think there are things I would tweak, but if you look last year, there were things that we were trying to tweak, whether it was conferences, this team really should be in this team, and how it really should all phase out, and how should we fix the college football playoff? Like, I don't think we're in a position where we really need to fix the college football playoff. I think it's fine as it is. We saw the Super Bowl last night. The game is completely uncompetitive. The Chiefs did nothing the entire game, and yet we're the ones in college football. We're the ones with the flawed postseason. No, sometimes games go that way. So we're not going to fix it. We're in a good spot. I love our sport. I think there's a lot to look forward to in our sport. And there's a lot that we're going to get to in this game. So today, our show is going to center around teams that did not make the college football playoff in 2024, but are well-positioned with either their schedule, their returning production, their portal class, their incoming freshman class, coaching continuity, what have you. We're going to look at the teams that have a really good chance of making the 12-team playoff this upcoming fall. So a bunch of teams that didn't make it, maybe they can take a big step this upcoming year and get over the hump. There's some conversation, a little bit of momentum that's being created right now about fixing what I think is a huge issue in the sport, and that is feigning injuries or faking injuries. We are going to basically get rid of that here in 25. Like, we need to get rid of faking injuries. It's blatant, it's obvious, and there are things that we can institute that won't lead to a massive overhaul that can probably help us moving forward with that aspect of our game. So that's an easy fix. There's some momentum. There's some buzz. We'll give you our thoughts on the matter at the end of the show. But we will kick things off by talking about some college football playoff contenders in 25. We will start with the LSU Tigers. And this one, I don't feel like I need to convince a lot of people of LSU being good. They're always pretty dang good. Now, this past year, there were some inconsistencies for sure. On the defensive side, there were occasional inconsistencies down the stretch with Garrett Nussmeier's decision-making. They had some challenges and could have very easily lost more games than they did. But if you look at one off-season theme for LSU and for the last two national champions, Ohio State and Michigan, what's one thing that they have used to describe their approach to the upcoming season? That would be, quote, all in. Brian Kelly and LSU have alignment, and it feels like they're pushing all their chips into the table. Feels like this is the year where we have the quarterback, we have the personnel coming back, and we have the ability to attract pieces in the portal that can get us over the hump. Feels like this is a year they've had circled, and it does feel like with their aggressiveness in the portal this offseason, they should feel pretty excited about where things are going. They signed 8 top 100 transfers. They signed 9 overall in this transfer class that started at least 7 games at their previous destination. Couple of notables too. Wide receiver, they still have Aaron Anderson. He's going to be great to take some of the pressure off Garrett Nussmeier. Garrett Nussmeier is great, by the way. I think there's a couple things I'd like to see him do a little better. Maybe take off and run a little bit more. He's a good athlete. He just refuses to run. It's like he views quarterback scramble as a sign of weakness. It's not. taking off and running and being athletic would be helpful. And then 2, I think sometimes he has a little bit too much faith in his arm, but man, the guy's super talented and he's really gifted. You look at the quarterbacks that are back in the Southeastern Conference, there are few that I would pick before Garrett Nussmeier, if any. So he's in a great spot. And the additions they've made at receiver with Barry and Brown transferring from Kentucky, Nick Anderson transferring from Oklahoma. Those are guys with top end speed that can immediately have a huge impact on this group collectively. You had some pass rush with Patrick Payton from Florida State. You get good quality in the back end with Delane, transfer from Virginia Tech, who was an all ACC player. And this defense in year number 2 under Blake Baker should take a pretty big step forward. Now, there are parts that I'm a little concerned about. That defense last year gave up 24 points a game. That's a problem. I think that Harold Perkins has long been a bit of an enigma because he's super talented, has had very flashy moments, but hasn't been the down in and down out difference maker that you want at the second level of a defense that's hyper aggressive. You also have to replace 3 offensive linemen that are really, really good on an offensive line last year that I think had probably the best left tackle in college football. So that's something to be concerned about as well. They did, however, go out and get a high-level high school class as well. And the schedule is pretty tough. It's an SEC schedule, but if you really look at what they have, it's not outrageously impossible. Like, they can win all these games, but it'll be tough for sure. The good news is most of their most difficult games are at home this year. They go to Clemson to start the season, and they desperately need to get a win there in week 1 because Brian Kelly is 0-3 in week 1 games at LSU. Coming out of the gate, 0-1's tough spots. You go on the road to another top 5, top 7, top 10 team in Clemson. That'll be a tough game, but one that LSU can win. You got Florida coming to you on the 13th of September. You got Ole Miss coming to you on the 27th of September. South Carolina is at your place on the 11th of October. So is A&M on the 25th. The one other super difficult road game that they'll deal with is on the 8th of November when they travel to Tuscaloosa to take on the Crimson Tide. So you look at the schedule, you look at the personnel returning, the quarterback consistency that we're likely going to get from Garrett Nussmeier, the year 2 progression that we're expecting on the defensive side from Blake Baker, and some of the pieces that were added via the transfer portal. I think this is a year when LSU makes the college football playoff. I think they're going to be in, and I think when they get there, they're going to be a huge problem for just about anybody standing in their way. Miami, yes, they lose their starting quarterback, Cam Ward, and we know that Miami was this close last year. So, Miami's a playoff contender this year. Greg, way to take a chance. Okay, I'm not intending to go viral with some dramatic prognostications. I liked Miami last year. I like Miami again this year. I like the program that Mario Cristobal has created, and I think now they're not going to have to be as heavily reliant on annual transfer portal additions. It feels like this is a group that the foundation has been built via high school recruiting, and they can kind of pick and choose. All right, yes, we need help there. Yes, we need a little depth there. Yes, we lost our quarterback. We can get a veteran. Carson Beck's on the table. Yeah, we'll take him. So I look at where they're at as a program, and I'm super optimistic with the balance that they have between homegrown development and going out and picking and choosing the portal pieces that they want to highlight. They can, if they want to, like they have the last couple of years, go out and get a ton of guys in the portal. That's not exactly the way they're going. So you look at Carson Beck, we'll start there, because a lot of the excitement surrounding Miami is probably hedged because of Cam Ward's departure and how good Cam Ward was. And the perception that Carson Beck is maybe a little bit up and down. I'll go back to kind of what Cam Ward was prior to arriving at Miami. And you know what Cam Ward was? He was a guy that played kind of out of structure an awful lot. He took a lot of risks with the football. He was kind of a one-man show and didn't have a ridiculous amount of help around him at Washington State. They had a good team, but it was kind of all about Cam Ward. Well, if you actually look back at last year's version of Georgia, what was Georgia offensively? you might think, and you will see the G and the silver breeches and the red jersey, and you'll think, well, Carson Beck had unbelievable talent around him. No, he didn't. Carson Beck had a running back in Trevor Etienne that was in and out of the lineup. He had a receiving core that led the country in drops. He had an offensive line that at times got completely overwhelmed, most notably against Kentucky and against Ole Miss. They got pushed around an awful lot up front because they were guys that were in and out of the lineup. The left tackle was a huge problem. He got replaced at one point. They lost Tate Ratledge. He was out of the lineup for a while. They had to force another guy in there. They were just kind of mixing and matching the whole season. So it felt like in many ways, and it was a running game that averaged like 100 yards a game. They couldn't take any pressure off the passing game. So Carson Beck, if you look at where Cam Ward was and where Carson Beck was, albeit, okay, Washington State personnel, Georgia personnel, very different with the supporting cast. What was put on Cam Ward's shoulders at Washington State is very comparable to what was put on Carson Beck's shoulders. It was all about him. If he played well, they won. If he didn't play well, they lost. Pretty simple and probably not fair. You also look at what they have coming back around Carson Beck. You look at the offensive line. You got a bunch of guys back, 4 starting offensive linemen back from the number 1 scoring offense in college football. You have a system with the passing attack that I think is actually really well suited to what Carson Beck wants to be. They have at least 6 top 100 players that were brought in via the transfer portal. Like I said, at least 6. Well, because some of the groups that are ranking these players, some have them in the hundreds, some don't have them in the top 100. Either way, they had a really good additions in the portal. You go out and get a bunch of different positions of need that they needed as well. They did lose a top-tier wide receiver in Isaiah Horton, but I do think they're probably feeling pretty good about what they have at wideout and the personnel they might be able to attract at that spot. You look at the schedule, too. The schedule is difficult, but not impossible. 2 of its toughest games for Miami are at home, including the game against Notre Dame. That'll be on the 31st of August. That'll be on Sunday night, so we're all looking forward to that. And Notre Dame's got a lot of pieces to replace in their own right. I'm also super bullish on Florida, so you'll play Florida a little later in the month. There in September, they'll come to Miami, and what will likely try to be a game you would think that Florida's had circled after the way things went for them last year. At Florida State's a tricky one, but who knows at this point how good Florida State's going to be. Playing Louisville on a short week on a Friday on the 17th of October is also very difficult. You go to SMU. But looking at kind of the rest of the schedule, yes, road game at Pittsburgh at the end of the year. Yes, road game at Virginia Tech at the end of the year. There are some tough spots in there for sure, but they should be favored in pretty much every game. If you really look at it, I think they'll be favored against Notre Dame at home. I think they'll be favored against Florida at home. I think they'll probably be favored on the road at Florida State, more than likely, until that point where Florida State proves they can kind of play up and rise to the occasion. And hey, that game's in October. Maybe they will by that point. The only game I'm not sure 100% certainty they'll be an underdog in is that at SMU game, because I'm still a little unsure about what SMU is going to be. So I look at Miami, and while people are concerned about Carson Beck's elbow and being able to participate in the spring and how much chemistry will be lost if he can't throw in the spring and in the early part of the summer, guys, Carson Beck's a 5th-year senior. He's been around. He knows what he's doing. He'll be fine. I'm not concerned about it whatsoever. It's a very quarterback-friendly offense, and I think he'll step right in and probably remind everybody why he was the Heisman favorite going into last year. Illinois is another team that's coming off a big breakthrough. Brett Bielema did a tremendous job last year, produced the program's first 10-win season since 2001, and you look at kind of where they are, I'm really optimistic about where the Illini might be heading. Now, they haven't won, had winning seasons in consecutive seasons since 2010, 2011. So it's been a while since they've had this type of expectations, and it's also been a while since they've maybe played with the target on their chest. But you look at what's back. Some of the pieces that I put the biggest stock in, they have a lot of pieces back at those spots. They bring back Luke Altmaier, who I think did a really good job at times last year. He's not a complete freak show, but I think he's got a lot of game, and he knows how he fits within the offense. You bring back all 5 along the offensive line. You bring back some quality pieces at the second level defensively and in the back end. You go out in the portal and you add some important guys that can be helpful, like Hudson Clement from West Virginia at wide receiver, a couple of solid defensive linemen, a couple of solid off-the-ball pieces as well. You look at where the Big Ten is right now. Illinois, I'm not just saying this to garner a significant reaction. There will be people this summer that will pick Illinois to potentially play in the Big Ten championship game. Now, I think that's a little bit too far-fetched. It seems like a lot, but when you win 10 games the year before and you bring back 18 starters from a team that won the Citrus Bowl over another playoff contender in South Carolina, people are going to feel good about what you have. I just think the receivers departing, not easy to replace, and to lose some quality pieces along the defensive line, like Edwards, like Briggs, those guys won't be easily, their production will not be easily replicated. Pat Bryant, though, is probably the biggest loss. Zachary Franklin also had a really nice year at times last year, but the schedule is really manageable. And we look last year at Indiana, and Indiana punching their ticket to the dance and getting to the playoff, and really at the time not having a whole lot of signature victories on their schedule. Yeah, but you know what Indiana also didn't have was a bunch of losses. Why? Because their schedule was manageable. You look at what they have. There's really 3 very tough road games for Illinois at Indiana, Washington, and Wisconsin. But everything else is, for the most part, okay. It's not that bad. Okay, so you got Duke early on. Like I said, you got Indiana. There's a real chance they could be 6-0 before they play Ohio State at home on October 11th. You think, all right, they can get some momentum, and then you got Ohio State and a big opportunity, fine. All right, you lose to Ohio State, but you still have a win against SC. You have a win on the road at Indiana. You have a win on the road at Washington and at Wisconsin. This team's probably going to be a 10-2 football team, maybe a 9-3 football team. And if we learned this last year, being in the Big Ten, being in the SEC, you're sitting at 10-2, you're sitting at 9-3, you're going to be in the mix. And I think Illinois has a real chance with what they bring back to be in the mix yet again. We'll go out west just a little bit, talk a little BYU. An 11-2 record, 7-2 in the Big 12 last year. It's pretty obvious that right now, with where the Big 12 is at, and the Big 12 is a great league, highly entertaining league. The difference between the best team and the worst team is as small in the Big 12 as it is in any other league by a mile. It's also a league that's spread really wide. More so than it is deep, it's really wide, where everybody can kind of beat each other. But BYU might have the best case to be made as the preseason favorite in the Big 12. They've returned their quarterback in Jake Retzlaff. They've returned a top running back in LJ Martin and a couple of really good pieces at wide receiver like Chase Roberts and Keelan Marion. And then defensively, they have a bunch of pieces back as well. Yeah, they also lost a couple of really good pieces on the edges of their defense along the defensive line. They lost a couple off the offensive line as well. But if you look at what they had last year, they're in a pretty good position to at least sustain the level that they were at a year ago. They bring back 4 of their top 5 tacklers. So that should be really encouraging. They do have to reload, like I said, up front defensively, but their schedule is pretty manageable as well. They do have a road game at Iowa State. They do have a road game at Colorado, but they avoid Arizona State. They avoid Kansas State. There's things to like about how this schedule sets up. A ton of continuity back on offense, especially with what Retzlaff did down the stretch and how he could continue to progress within this offense. And I think there's reason to be super bullish on what the Cougars can be. I like them a lot. I love Kalani Sitake. I've always loved Kalani Sitake, and I feel like his culture is going to be very impactful moving forward when the margins are thin in the Big 12. That culture could maybe steal them a win or two along the way. Let's look at that schedule. I referenced a couple tough road games at Arizona, at Colorado, at Iowa State. I think at Texas Tech could be a tricky one this year. That game's in early November, but the home schedule is gettable. West Virginia's at your place. Utah, rivalry game, that's at your place. TCU's at your place, and so is UCF. in the final game of the regular season. When you look at it, man, you look at how things could size up for BYU. Feels like 9 wins is possible. 10 wins could very much be in the mix as well, depending on whether or not they can adequately replace those pieces along the defensive line. That's really the big question mark. I have a lot of confidence in Kalani Sitake and this roster continuing to move forward, and in a league that could go in any direction. Remember, what was Arizona State picked last year in the preseason in the Big 12? I think 15th of 16. Well, they went and made the playoff. It wouldn't surprise me at all if BYU is the team that hoists the championship trophy in the Big 12 this year and punches their ticket to the dance. The Michigan Wolverines will also be a team that, while they missed the playoff this past year, I'm not sure it would surprise anybody. Given how they finished up, I'm not sure it would surprise anybody to see Michigan back in the mix this upcoming year. I know people are going to probably put a little bit more stake than they probably should based on how things went in the bowl game against Alabama and how things went in the final game of the regular season against Ohio State. I understand that those are individual circumstances, but at the same time, how can you not allow that to factor into your evaluation? I know it's going to factor into mine because I think last year, I think about what they didn't have more so than what they had. And what they didn't have was quality quarterback play. And anything but quality quarterback play. It was almost at times hard to watch that position for Michigan. There was seldom a threat of the pass. If there was, it was almost, all right, well, we'll keep them honest and throw it downfield, and hopefully one of our guys will go make a play. Regardless of who ends up starting at quarterback for Michigan, it might be Mikey Keene, the transfer from Fresno State, who's long been a super productive player. He's not going to blow you away with his physical attributes, but he's always been pretty productive. And this is an offense that I think doesn't need too much from the quarterback spot. If they can continue to run the ball with efficiency, if they can continue to be a very physical football team, they can lean on their defense, the quarterback simply has to just manage the game, manage the situations, and Mikey Keene's a veteran player that has seen just about every possible situation that college football can throw at you, and he can probably steer the ship. But if they decide that they might need a little bit higher ceiling out of the quarterback position, well, perfect. We'll go with the number one prospect in the ESPN top 300, and that's Bryce Underwood. So that's a guy with all the attributes, all the ability, all the skill, but maybe not the experience, and he might have to learn on the job. Would it surprise you if Michigan took a similar approach to their quarterback development to what Florida took last year? Florida started the veteran quarterback early in the year, but they sprinkled in DJ Lagway a little bit throughout the season. Graham Mertz ultimately gives away a little bit more, and a little bit more. Now, Graham Mertz was a little bit banged up there in the early going, which allowed Lagway to step into the mix. But then ultimately, Mertz gets hurt. Lagway steps in, and because of the reps that he had garnered early in the year, down the stretch, he started to play really confident, and his play just got better and better and better as the season went along. Is that how they'll approach it with Bryce Underwood? Probably. I'd be surprised if it is Mikey Keene, if it's his all season long. I think they'll probably, hey, every third series, we're going to go with the freshman. Every fourth series, we'll go with the freshman. The bigger the game, go with the hot hand. If it's Underwood that's seeing the field great and making great decisions, then he could be the guy that kind of takes Michigan's offense to the next level. I also love their offensive coordinator hire of Chip Lindsey. Did a really good job at North Carolina the last couple of years, a guy that really prides himself on being able to run the football. I think he's been around young quarterbacks in the past, so he'll know how to kind of bring Bryce Underwood along a little bit. So it'll be really interesting to see whether or not the 3-year starter at the FBS level and Mikey Keene can hold off Bryce Underwood down the stretch. They also had a couple other pieces. You got a redshirt freshman in Jordan Marshall that's probably going to be the number one back to start, but maybe it's Justice Haynes, the transfer from Alabama, that spells him just a little bit. So that should be a little interesting 1-2 punch there. But the defensive front, that's going to be really difficult to replace Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. That's to be expected, right? You expect Damon Payne, the transfer from Alabama, to go in and to be Mason Graham or Kenneth Grant. It's not going to happen. But can he be good enough to allow the edge players to have some success, because they do have some talent on the edges of their defense. A couple key games, tough schedule, by the way. I think it's a very tough schedule. At Oklahoma in the second week of the season, Oklahoma's in gotta-have-it mode for Brent Venables here in year number 3. They're at Nebraska, a team that I think is going to be a lot better in the middle of September. You also have Wisconsin at your place before you head to USC on October 11th. Think about this October, by the way. I think October is really, really tough. You have Wisconsin at home, at USC, Washington at home, at Michigan State. Now you're going to sit there and say, well, Michigan State's not going to be very good. USC might not be very good. Wisconsin and Washington, they might be a bowl team. But I just think that order, home, away, that Washington game's dangerous because you have an at SC and then you have at Michigan State, the rivalry game the following week. I think that's dangerous. It lightens up a little bit in November, but they still have to go to Maryland, which is a dangerous game, before they play Ohio State at home. So I think Michigan's one of those teams that if momentum can carry over from last year, they should feel pretty good about the trajectory they might be on this upcoming season. The Alabama Crimson Tide trying to bounce back this year after an up and down season for Kalen DeBoer in year number 1. I look at what's coming back on this team, and a lot of what has made me very bullish on Alabama is how the recipe was applied at Michigan 2 years ago, how the recipe was applied at Ohio State this past year. Now a similar recipe is trying to be applied at Alabama. Having guys that could go to the NFL, deciding to return even though they don't necessarily have to. That's big. I think Alabama has continuity and focus. You're already hearing about the players in the locker room saying out with the old, like we needed new leadership. The leadership now that's on this roster, they feel really good about. Sounds like they're really unified and they're anxious to kind of rewrite the messaging about what Alabama's capable of this upcoming season. They have some big names returning, like Ryan Williams at wide receiver, Jeremy Bernard at wide receiver. I think the offensive line should be pretty good with Brailsford at center, Caden Proctor at left tackle. But it's mainly the defense that I think most people feel really good about. Yeah, they lose some quality guys like Jahad Campbell's amazing, great player. But you look at what's back, there's a lot that's back on the defensive side. They have 9 starters returning, and most of those guys that are returning on defense were underclassmen, freshmen in some cases that were thrust into the starting lineup that decided to come back, hone in, and a big leap can be expected to be made from year 1 to year 2 in the program. Also, comfort level within Kane Wommack's scheme. It's a new defense, it's a new offense. There was a lot more transition at Alabama last offseason than people realized. And I think it was going to be tough for Kalen DeBoer to do it exactly how he wanted to do it because the expectation from within the locker room is that things were done a certain way under Nick Saban and the previous regime. So now they're moving more and more towards becoming Kalen DeBoer's type of team. I think that's going to be really beneficial for the continuity and the alignment they're going to have from head coach to player to assistant coach, what have you. The alignment's going to be really, really solid moving forward. They also did a great job in the recruiting class. Big reason why is they landed a big-time quarterback. Now, Keelan Russell, will he start? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that he'll be entrenched in the quarterback competition with guys that staff feels great about. Now, I look at Ty Simpson, and I was told by the staff that Ty Simpson might be the most talented guy on the roster 2 years ago. And at that time, he wasn't quite ready to be the guy. Just mentally or maturity-wise, just wasn't quite ready to take the reins and go. As a result, Jalen Milroe becomes the starting quarterback, has a great couple years as the starting quarterback. But Ty Simpson now, after sitting back, learning, focusing on development, becoming tougher, becoming stronger, getting a better grasp of the offense, he might be poised to kind of cash in on that potential that's always been there. But if he can't do it, it might be a true freshman. And Keelan Russell, by all accounts, is about as talented as it comes, one of the highest ranked recruits in the history of Alabama football. And now he comes in as the possible face of the franchise in the years to come. Now, in my opinion, I think it's probably beneficial for it to be Ty Simpson for at least a year, maybe 2, and then give way to Keelan Russell at some point down the road. If you look at development, look at Arch Manning. Arch Manning went in with tons of expectations, but he learned from the veteran for a couple years, and now he's poised as a redshirt sophomore to become the starting quarterback of a championship contender. I think that's a good approach. While everyone wants to play early, might not be best for your long-term development to be forced onto the field as a true freshman. So if there is a way to bridge from Ty Simpson to Keelan Russell, don't forget about Austin Mack. The staff really likes Austin Mack. They brought him with them from Washington when they got the job, and the addition of Ryan Grubb on offense cannot be understated. I think Grubb does a great job of creating accountability within the offensive meeting room, and I think the mix between Kalen DeBoer, Ryan Grubb, the rest of the staff is going to be really seamless because of the expectations and the amount of comfort they have working together for 17 of the past 19 years. I look at the schedule, and I think the schedule's tough. Like I said earlier, the schedule's always tough in the SEC, but a non-conference game on the road in the early going on August 30th against Florida State's a really tricky game. You get Wisconsin also at home. So you have two non-conference games against Power 5 competition. I think that's good to figure out where you're at. And Alabama, I think, to be honest with you, should probably be a favorite in both those games. Then you go on the road to Georgia after a bye week. That'll be a very tough game. As always, Tennessee comes to you. You're at South Carolina on October 25th. Should be a very tricky one before a tough November schedule that includes LSU, Oklahoma, and a road game at Auburn. I think it'll be a tough schedule for sure, but Alabama, with the continuity returning defensively, with consistency at quarterback, and quality pieces around the quarterback, they should be really well poised to have a big bounce back year in year number 2 for Kalen DeBoer. Moving on to Iowa State, and we'll talk about them a little bit like we talked about BYU just a moment ago. I don't think the Big 12 is in a position to necessarily put two teams in the college football playoff. It's just the perception of the league, the depth of the league, the parity in the league. It's hard for me to imagine a situation in which you have a couple at-larges that are getting in the mix. But Iowa State, with what they return, 11-win season, Big 12 championship game appearance, feels like they have kind of everything that you could possibly want to maybe take the next step and actually make it to the college football playoff. Of course, you got to win the Big 12 potentially, but name a team other than Iowa State that you feel just as good about. Look at Jalen Noel being gone, Jaden Higgins being gone at wide receiver. That's a lot. Those guys combined for 167 catches and nearly 2,400 yards. So replacing that productivity, going to be very tough. They did go to the portal and add a receiver from East Carolina. They added a receiver from UCF. That will hopefully replenish some of those pieces. And they got to find some reinforcements up front defensively to create more pressure without having to blitz. This was a group that did not do a very good job affecting the opposing quarterback this past year. They had just 16 sacks on the season. That was dead last in the Big 12. So they need to be better there. But continuity is back, a lot of pieces back, and you know Matt Campbell's going to get the best out of this team this year. They got a veteran quarterback in Rocco Beck. They got some really good running backs. They have a physical group along the offensive line. There's a lot to like about Iowa State this year. What I don't like as much is the schedule. Schedule is tough. Week 0, they'll head to Dublin to play Kansas State. Very, very interesting game there, week 1, involving two teams that might have college football playoff hopes. They have Iowa coming to them on September 6th. That'll be great. Arizona might bounce back. They're a home game, though, for Iowa State. I think they're going to be all right in that game. For a tricky road trip to Cincinnati and Colorado in consecutive weeks. BYU is at home. Arizona State is at home before going to TCU there on the 8th of November and then finishing up with the home game against the Kansas Jayhawks. So I look at Iowa State, and I think they're really, really solid, but this is a tough schedule coming up for the Cyclones. Well, if we're looking for momentum and how teams finished a year ago, there might not be a team that carries more momentum into this upcoming season than the Florida Gators. It's their first winning season since 2020, but there are a lot of expectations that are kind of sitting on the shoulders of DJ Lagway and a team that finished really, really strong. I'm really optimistic about what Billy Napier's team was able to accomplish last year. And like I said, if momentum factors in, and it might very well factor in, nobody has more momentum than the Florida Gators heading into this season. Let's look at what they have, okay? Things have stabilized. They have a bunch of guys back on the offensive side of the football, including most of the offensive line. You have a potential difference maker, a potential game changer in DJ Lagway at quarterback. They also bring back 8 starters on the defensive side, mostly along the defensive line and in the secondary. So the 2 positions that are of the most importance, they have a ton of guys back. So I'm really, really bullish on the returning production. They did lose their top 2 wide receivers, so that's not really, not really something that a lot of people are talking about, but probably should be talking a little bit more about that. Now, Eugene Wilson, if he can get back to be his old self, that'd be significant, but he was banged up and missed most of the season last year. And the defense did lose their top 3 tacklers, including a couple of guys to the NFL draft and one guy in Jack Pyburn to Texas A&M. So you look at where they're at right now, a lot of momentum, but still a ton of hurdles on the schedule as well. I love Florida this year. I think there's a lot of reasons to be bullish, but the playoffs, that's a pretty big gap from a 7-5 regular season to a playoff contending regular season. It's a tough one to imagine. And the schedule is extremely difficult. At LSU on the 13th, at Miami on the 20th, Texas is there in October on the first Saturday in October. You're at A&M. Georgia is, of course, the neutral site there on November 1st. At Ole Miss, Tennessee at home, and then Florida State at home. It's a very, very difficult schedule for the Florida Gators, but they do have a bunch of continuity, and they have guys that have played in big games before, ton of returning starts, ton of returning production, and just a couple pieces that need to be replaced. They're a good dark horse in the SEC, but there's still a lot of things I need to figure out throughout the spring. The Ole Miss Rebels, they've done such a great job here in the portal era of college football. I mean, so much of their success has been going out and getting guys for 1 year and saying, hey, come be a part of our program at Ole Miss. We're going to get a bunch of guys from a bunch of different places. We're going to kind of bring it all together, and we're going to maybe have the most talented roster. We might give up a little bit in culture, but we're going to have arguably the most talented roster in the sport. That was the case last year. I think you could have made a case that Ole Miss had as talented a roster as anybody outside of Ohio State. I think that will be reflected in the NFL draft coming up this season. You look at their schedule again this year, things look pretty good. 5 of their first 6 games are at home. But this is a year where they're not as reliant on the portal. Now, they still have the number 2 class or the number 3 class, but only 6 top 100 transfers. That's second most in the SEC, so still a lot, but it doesn't feel quite as significant as it was last year. They also go out, they got offensive line, they got edge on the defense with Princewell Uman-Mielen. So 2 guys that Kutas on the offensive line from Arkansas, Uman-Mielen from Nebraska, that could be significant. Their high school class is also pretty good. Plus, there's also a kid that I think most people might have some level of familiarity with, but probably not enough. I'm just going to tell you, Austin Simmons, he was their backup quarterback last year. He will be their starting quarterback this year, more than likely. He hasn't won the job yet. They haven't announced that he's the starter, but this guy's insanely talented. He's a lefty. He's really gifted. If you haven't watched him, you can go back and take a peek at how he performed under very bright lights against the Georgia Bulldogs. He led them on the first touchdown drive of the game, right down the field. A couple of key 3rd and 4th down conversions on the drive as well. Austin Simmons is a name you need to know, and he could, even though he's not a guy that's going to have a ton of hoopla and excitement around his prospects as the starter. He's not going to have anywhere near the hype of some other first-year starters. He might be as talented as just about anybody out there. So we'll see how it goes. Talent doesn't always equate to elite level play. Talent is one thing. Being highly productive and efficient is another. There's plenty of guys that have outrageous talent that haven't been very good. There's been a million examples of that. But if the efficiency can match the talent level, Ole Miss is going to be in really good hands at the quarterback spot. I'm just telling you, they're going to be in really, really good shape there. Schedule, like I said, somewhat manageable. They do have LSU in September, but September's pretty gettable. First really difficult road game is at Georgia. That's on the 18th of October. They follow that game at Oklahoma, so a tough 2-game stretch there Go play the Dogs, go play the Sooners in consecutive weeks. They finish at home with South Carolina and Florida. If Ole Miss doesn't make the playoffs this year, it'd be a big disappointment. They really would. Just looking at the schedule, looking at the pieces that they've added, and knowing how close they were last year to breaking down that door, this feels like a year they need to get over the hump, and they can't lose games they have no business losing like they did last year against Florida and against Kentucky. The Auburn Tigers are desperate for a bounce-back year here in 2025. They were 5-7 last year, but it does feel like, for whatever reason, Auburn might have been better than the record would indicate last year. They had a couple close calls. They struggled offensively. They had a couple games in which they didn't even know what jersey they were wearing. They turned the ball over so often. They made a very big mistake in changing quarterbacks going into the Arkansas game because they thought Peyton Thorne was going to turn the ball over. They go with the guy that can't play, and next thing you know, they're in the same exact situation where he's turning the ball over. They had to give way back to Peyton Thorne, and the rest is history. This team, even though they were 5-7, felt like they could have easily been 8-4 at the end of the season. It really felt that way. And I think with the addition of Jackson Arnold at quarterback, I'm pretty optimistic about them solidifying that spot. Now, Jackson Arnold, let's just acknowledge what it is. Last year, all the expectations in the world were on his shoulders for Oklahoma. The hopes of Brent Venables, they just watched Dylan Gabriel walk out the door because they felt that confident in Jackson Arnold. Now, did the Oklahoma staff completely whiff? I don't think they did. I think they saw this kid practice for a year and they said, this guy's the real deal. We can let Dylan Gabriel walk because this Jackson Arnold kid's going to be great. Well, turns it over a couple times, gets shell-shocked a little bit against Tennessee, and can't ever really get it back on track, right? There were just moments in fall camp leading up, in spring ball prior to, in the bowl game before both, that Jackson Arnold's confidence wasn't where it needed to be. So it will take a little while for Hugh Freeze to rebuild Jackson Arnold's confidence level and to turn him back into the can't-miss five-star prospect that started his career at Oklahoma. We've seen this happen before, by the way. It was at South Carolina, but it was not something that was that dissimilar to when Spencer Rattler left Oklahoma and revitalized his career at South Carolina. Was a really good player for a couple years for the Gamecocks. Maybe that can happen for Jackson Arnold. They went out and they got him some help too. They go out and get a couple difference makers in the portal along the offensive line. You go out and get wide receiver Eric Singleton from Georgia Tech, who's got tons of speed downfield. You go and add a few other pieces as well there along both the offensive and defensive lines. I think there's a lot to like about what Auburn has going for them heading into this upcoming season. You look at the schedule, I think September's very tough. At Baylor, at Oklahoma, at Texas A&M, 3 difficult road games, all probably going to be pretty warm in each one of those 3 venues, by the way, in August, mid-September, and late September. But either way, 3 tough road games, but then it gets a little bit more manageable down the stretch as far as how many games will be played in Jordan-Hare. There's one thing you know about Auburn, they're a very different team at home than they are on the road. So if they can just survive September, get through September, whether it's unblemished, unbeaten, maybe they have one loss, it wouldn't surprise me if they gave Georgia all they wanted on October 11th. I think they can get Missouri at home, would expect them to. Going to Arkansas on October 25th will be tough, but things really lighten up in November before they host Alabama on the final week of the regular season. So while Auburn might feel like a little bit of a stretch at this point, if they can figure out quarterback, if they can get consistency from that position and not turn the ball over, they might be in a pretty good spot to potentially contend here in year number 3 for Hugh Freeze for a college football playoff spot. We'll go next to the USC Trojans. And there's a big gap between where SC is right now and getting to the playoff, but I'm confident in some of the things that they did defensively. I think they're going to be trending in the right direction in year number 2 on that side of the ball. I like some of the pieces they added in the portal, like Keyshawn Silver from a defensive lineman from Kentucky. You go out and get quality pieces in the back end. You get Eli Sanders from New Mexico, who had a really nice year going for over 1,000 yards. there's a lot to like about some of the pieces that are on this roster that have recently been added to this roster. You can also look, though, unfortunately, at a couple pieces that were lost. You lose a couple offensive linemen. You lose a quality back there to Texas Tech. You lose a couple of really good wide receivers in Zachariah Branch to Georgia and Deuce Robinson to Florida State. They're really good, and that will not be easy. You also lose Hudson to Penn State. So there's a lot of guys that need to be replaced at wide receiver, but guys, it's Lincoln Riley. Like, when has Lincoln Riley ever been at a loss in involving top-tier skill at the wide receiver spot? They've always had good receivers, and I know they'll have a good passing attack again because I liked some of the things I saw from Jaden Mayava there at the end of the year. Now, while there were some moments that were super inconsistent, there were also a couple of throws that he made, for instance, in the Notre Dame game where you're like, all right, I get it. He's very talented. Now it's just about we got to eliminate the catastrophic mistake. If you can eliminate the catastrophic mistake for Jaden Mayava, they're going to be in a really good spot. If they can adequately replace those wide receivers, this passing game has a chance to be better than it was last year. Now, expected consistent improvement on defense, passing attack maybe slightly better than a year ago, maybe a little bit more of a commitment to the run game, and USC might be cooking with gas. You also look at the schedule, and it's not unbearable. It's not easy, but it's not unbearable. September's, for the most part, manageable. They have a road trip to Illinois at the end of the month, but Michigan State's at home. September, they should be in a pretty good spot. At worst, they have one loss. October, you get Michigan at home before you go to Notre Dame, and then you go to Nebraska a little bit later as well. So kind of a tough stretch there between October 11th and November 1st. You finish by playing Iowa at home and then going to Oregon on the 22nd of November as well. So the schedule gets a little bit tougher as the season goes along, but this is a team that had the lead in a lot of games this year. They just couldn't finish. Will they learn how to finish this season? We'll go next to Kansas State. Just be brief here because I think we talked a little bit already about BYU. We talked a little bit already about Iowa State. It's a team that was 9-4 last year. They won at least 9 games for the third straight season since 2024, and the record would have been pretty good if they hadn't lost just 3 of their last 4 home games. Or 3 of their last 4 regular season games. So you got some returning players that are back that are legit, and Avery Johnson, Dylan Edwards, Jace Brown. Like, there's a lot to like about what they bring back offensively, but this is one thing that's interesting. They brought in 14 transfers. I think, too, about Chris Kleiman and the approach that they've had and the emphasis that they've put on culture for a very long time. Well, they're playing in the portal. I mean, Kansas State is not afraid to go and add pieces and address departures because they know they're kind of in win-now mode. You go out and get guys from Arizona, South Alabama, Oklahoma, all can help solidify the back end of their defense. You go and get a couple of receivers, too, that can help take the offense to the next level. So there's a lot to like about where things are, but they're also, I feel like they've kind of improved in a lot of the places where they really needed to improve. You even were able to go out and get guys from Alabama, get guys from Ohio State. I mean, they're going out and landing pretty high-profile players. You look at the schedule, it's tough. I mean, it's the Big 12. Every game feels losable, but every game also feels winnable. You got Iowa State to start the season in Dublin. You're at Arizona, UCF. You're at Baylor, at Kansas, at Utah. So a lot of tough road trips there. But I do think some of their tougher games, UCF at home, TCU at home, Texas Tech at home, Colorado at home, they're at home. So I actually like where things are this year for Kansas State. And like I said earlier, I think only one Big 12 team will make it, but Kansas State wouldn't surprise me at all if they are that team. And we will finish by talking about a team that narrowly missed the college football playoff last year, and that's the South Carolina Gamecocks. They have not won 10-plus games since 2013. So it's going to be tough. The schedule is very difficult, but you have a great quarterback back in Lenora Sellers. You bring back a lot pieces along the offensive line, and you bring back a game changer defensively in Dylan Stewart. I like some of the guys that they have on the offensive side. Like, I think Mazeo Bennett's a really good player at wide receiver in the slot. But the defensive departures will be significant. You lose Kyle Kennard. You lose a couple of great defensive linemen and TJ Sanders and Tonka Hemingway, guys that had played a ton of football. This was a very veteran team last year, and to adequately replace all 3 linebackers, a couple of big pieces along the defensive front will not be easy. Now, they did go out and they did a pretty good job of getting some good pieces offensively. You get Rashul Faison from Utah State, who had a really nice 1,100-yard season to replace Rocket Sanders. Rocket Sanders had a solid year last year. You also go out and get Brandon Cisse at defensive back. Could probably play corner, but is a pretty versatile piece there in the back end. So there's a lot to like about what was added to this group. But most of the reason why people are bullish on South Carolina is because of LaNorris Sellers. Now, LaNorris Sellers, I think if you can get improved threat of the pass, he becomes a super dynamic, borderline unstoppable piece. But in order for them to improve throwing the football, they need to have more adequate playmakers on the perimeter. That's one area where they were very inconsistent last year. So if that group can be more consistent to help LaNorris Sellers out, that could be really big. Because when he takes off and he runs and he wants to make guys miss, he's very difficult to contain. But if you can force him to stay in the pocket and try to pick you apart by throwing the football, that's where he becomes a little bit more human as things go along. But new offense coordinator Mike Shula is really good at developing quarterbacks, managing quarterbacks. I think he'll do a really good job with LaNorris Sellers' development in the pocket here throughout the offseason. The schedule is very difficult, extremely difficult. Virginia Tech early at LSU are very tough spots. You get Oklahoma and Alabama at home before you go to Ole Miss, who's a playoff contender, to A&M, who might very well be in the mix for the playoff spot, and then you have Clemson that comes to you there at the very end of the year. A 5-0 start for South Carolina is not out of the realm of possibility. And if they can somehow beat LSU, which is a tall task, then 7-0 is very much in the mix. So 10 win, definitely possible, and 10 wins, I think, gets the Gamecocks to the postseason. I will get you out of here because there's a little bit of momentum that's now being created about doing away with faking injuries, which to me is so long overdue, man. I'm so over the faking injuries. Everybody knows it. You can watch it. You can see guys go down. I've even seen team signals from the sideline. I have seen a team signal in on the sideline, pointing to a guy, telling him to go down, basically. I won't give away the signal, but I've seen it happen on the field. And nothing can be done about it right now. But at the AFCA, that's American Football Coaches Association, there was a convention about a month ago in Charlotte. And there's a small committee of coaches that are coming up with an idea. Now, if you get hurt, that player is unavailable for the rest of the drive. But a team can buy that player back in by calling timeout. So if, for instance, the quarterback, they want to call a timeout to put him back in the game, that's totally fine. But if the quarterback gets a cramp and he's out for the rest of that drive, regardless of the circumstances. Now, there's a couple of issues with this, okay? Like I said, quarterback. That's pretty much where all the coaches are super concerned, because if a quarterback is for whatever reason removed, that's a huge personnel loss, right? So quarterback is a tricky situation to be in. The other thing that people are a little worried about is that if a guy gets hurt, well, he doesn't want to go down because then he would have to miss the whole drive. So if he's hurt and he stays in the game, could that make his exposure to further injury higher? So those are the two things that people are pushing back against. So one thing that I think would be really valuable is if a player is lost, if a player is not available, if he goes down, if he's hurt, he's on the sideline for the rest of the series. I'm okay with that. If it's the quarterback, why don't we just change the rules for the quarterback? To me, that's a pretty simple rule. We look all the time at defenseless players and how they're treated differently. Well, why can't we do the same thing with the quarterback as it relates to the injury? If the quarterback is hurt and gets a cramp and has to miss a play before he goes back in, so be it. The rules for the quarterback are different than the rules of every other player. To me, that feels reasonable enough. If we're doing, quote, faking injuries and we're worried about stopping injuries being faked, well, good. Is the quarterback going to be the one that fakes the injury? Probably not. So if the quarterback's down, he's probably down for good reason. And he can probably, if he can't come back in the game, he'll try to, whatever the circumstances are. But we're trying to eliminate faking injuries, and the quarterback is not going to be a position that is asked to fake an injury. So I think just apply different rules to the quarterback. A quarterback can be subbed back into the game at any point. regardless of whether or not he was injured, assuming he's cleared by the medical professional, assuming he's cleared, he can go back into the game at any point, doesn't have to miss the whole drive. But every other position, guess what? The rule is if you get hurt, you're out. And I think it's going to be up to the coaches to monitor their players. And if the players look banged up or they're not going 100% or they can't give max effort, they have to get them out. So I think this is a pretty simple solution. Treat the quarterback differently. We already do that in several other instances. And if you get hurt, you're out for the series. Simple enough. If we find out that you submitted a player back into the game after he was hurt earlier in the drive, then you lose not just a timeout, but you are also flagged with a 15-yard unsportsmanlike penalty. To me, it's simple. We can do something about it. There's fines, these after-the-fact fines, all this stuff is fine. We can tell with a couple of looks on a replay review whether or not a guy is injured. We can also tell when the injury is being faked. It's been called out by broadcasters forever. I've called it out forever. So, pretty simple. Guy goes down, out for the series. Quarterback goes down, different set of rules. Guy goes down, out for a play. They try to get him back in. Timeout plus 15-yard penalty, unsportsmanlike conduct on the coaching staff. Pretty simple. I think we can probably get this in sooner than later. Please, let's get this fixed. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. For all of us here at ACF, we appreciate you guys. Continue to ask you to like, to rate, and to subscribe to the show wherever you get the show. We also really appreciate those of you that are telling your friends and following us here on the social media platform. My personal account is at Greg McElroy, but we also have Always CFB that you can follow on both Instagram and on Twitter, so you can check out and interact with the show throughout the week. For all of us here at Always College Football, from Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.